Hello, thank you so much for having me. AI, I'm sure you've probably had a conversation about it in the last 24 hours. It's evolving at a pace we've never seen before. Some are calling it the next industrial revolution. Science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And it feels like magic sometimes, doesn't it, when we use those AI tools. The sheer pace of its evolvement has lent itself to a plethora of clickbaity articles about how AI is coming for our jobs, and it's the death of creativity. But historically, technology and creativity have led to amazing innovation. Look at music. We wouldn't have whole genres like hip-hop without sampling. Look at art. The invention of photography led artists to think about what the paintbrush could do that the camera could not. So what's next? Are we in an age where weapons of mass production are going to water down our creative outputs? Or is AI the next step forward for collective human intelligence? Let's discuss. I can't wait to get into it. Please let me introduce my panel. To the stage, we have Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman of Ogilvy. A little clap, perhaps. We've got Stephan, Pretorius, CTO of WPP. And Antonis Kocheilas, Ogilvy's Chief Technology Officer. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this, and I just know we're not going to have enough time from our calls. So let's start really broad. Where in your industries and work right now are you seeing AI contribute to creative innovation or not?
I've seen films produced which are astounding, where effectively no natural light has been involved in their creation. No film crew, nothing of the kind. And that, I have to say, is astonishing. It's something I never expected to see in my lifetime, actually. So that's one thing which patently has to interest us.
Could I just give you the other side of that argument, if you don't mind?
Go on.
What about the Toys R Us advert? 'Cause that didn't get received very well, did it?
No, I mean, it's complicated, this area, but I mean, it's perfectly possible, of course, to do bad advertisements with humans as well.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, using humans is not a guarantee of success, and human judgment should still be, at some point, there needs to be some kind of, in case of fire, break glass mechanism in all decisions that are made of this kind, because otherwise it leads to kind of absurdity. By the way, I mentioned the book in my introductory talk, which is called The Unaccountability Machine. He makes the point that actually institutional systems, of decision-making are in themselves a form of artificial intelligence. In other words, you apportion decisions off according to certain rules. So a speed camera is, at a very crude level, an artificial intelligence, but so is actually a decision-making process. Once you actually accept that something is too much for a single brain, you have to design the way in which multiple brains interact. Now, what is interesting is those processes, whether entirely seemingly human or indeed involving some sort of silicon, can lead to insanity in both cases. So you have a country which is the richest and probably, I would say, the most talented country in the world, where you have to choose between two heads of state, both of whom are markedly worse than George III ever was. So that is not a process of computer-based intelligence, but it is a process of a formalized use of intelligence, which has probably in some cases been badly designed or needs to be corrected, or where there needs to be some sort of fire break or brake mechanism, I would argue. So it's not just about silicon versus carbon, by the way. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, to make it funny, I think I was reading somewhere that chiaroscuro, the Renaissance painting technique, when it was first introduced, it wasn't received well. They believed that they shadow the glory of God being depicted in images. So, yes, some applications of AI right now are misapplied or they are not used well. But the potential, and Georgia, you mentioned as innovation, the potential of innovating and creating things that weren't able to be created before is enormous.
I mean, I'd come back to your question more directly. I think, in the spirit of this conference, I think it's worthwhile to think about how people are adopting and using AI as a lens, right? So my observation is that things change both much faster and much slower in AI than we think, right? So in other words, most of us have no idea about the true potential and the true capability of the largest frontier models and the largest diffusion systems. Those of us who work in it are finding it hard to keep up and are constantly challenged to understand how these new capabilities change the way we work, change the way we think, change the way we make decisions. But largely, most people have not adopted it. So about 95% of all GPU use today is used to train large language models, in other words, by tech companies making new LLMs, not by companies or individuals doing inference against those models, right? So the AI arms race is practically currently being focused on developing new capability, not really on the use as much. And I think this is an important point, right? Because I saw a stat a couple of months ago, I'm not sure if it's still true, the average prompt per user of people that have used ChatGPT in their lifetime is 6.
Really?
6. Right? That's remarkably low, which means that people either don't care or don't want to go through the thoughtful process or the interaction process of interacting with the machine in that kind of way. Now, I'd argue the use of Copilot and Microsoft, to summarize meeting notes, or the use of AI in LinkedIn when you're looking at a news story and there's 3 recommendations for things to go further, those things are being used regularly. Right? Those sort of inflow tools or kind of productivity widgets that kind of increase or improve the way that our thoughts flow. I think those are being used and being adopted a lot more. But I think the core process of saying what can I do differently? How can I think differently? How can I create differently with a large language model? There are very few people in the world who are actually practically doing that today.
I agree. It's such a buzzword, and we'd love to talk about it, but I feel like it's not really truly implemented on a base level. And so I wanted to pull back and start with the creative process. I felt like that was most relevant to what we're talking about, and ask all of you how you've been using it within your brainstorms. I feel like the criticism of AI, which we've all seen, is that it's like a cheap way to copy people's work to get your homework done. But I find it, right? But I find using it a lot for my creative process and brainstorm that it's quite handy. And I often compare it to having a conversation with someone and then you thinking of an idea during that conversation. Does that mean that person came up with the idea? And I'd just be interested to hear from you how and if you've been using it in your brainstorming processes.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, of course, you're right about the average use. I mean, if you talk, on the other hand, to university students, you'll see a vastly heavier use because it has a very, very direct application. I also think, by the way, there is never anything wrong with checklists, okay? And one of the ways I use it is it generates a pretty good, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? I mean, I never have any hostility. I sometimes have hostility towards the idea of process. I'll let in all our clients into a secret. There isn't nearly as linear a process in the generation of advertising as we pretend there is. That's there to keep your procurement people happy because we charge by the hour. But we can't go and say, can you give us thousands of pounds to talk shit until we get lucky? Because that's not a good look, even though that's how it works 50%. I'm sorry to let you behind the curtain in that way, but it's kind of true. So there's a level of randomness and happenstance, but of course you can turn up the temperature, and there's a whole concept of temperature in AI, isn't there? Yeah. Where you can make it actually, slightly plodding and tedious and a low risk, but you can actually turn up the temperature to levels of weirdness, which I think could be potentially inspiring. But I certainly have absolutely no problem with any kind of technology that is, if you like, a kind of don't forget about. Just as they're wonderful in surgery and aviation, I think they're also wonderful in creative generation. We use this thing, the Mindspace template, for example. It's really great because there are whole avenues of inquiry you can just overlook. So I have absolutely total enthusiasm for its use in that particular way.
Also, it allows us to separate 3 notions that we use interchangeably sometimes: creating, making, and innovating.
Yeah.
In a process, those 3 things are being crunched together. But with AI, you can take making aside because making becomes easier, almost automated. You can make creating almost rapid because different associations can be brought to life if we choose to define creativity as creating new associations that didn't exist before. You can do that instantaneously, and you can then start innovating by testing thoughts that they didn't exist before. There is thoughts that they are not necessarily a combination of old facts, but they are products of epiphany, to use a word from my heritage, allows you to separate those three things. When you have the luxury, because it is a luxury to separate those three things, creating, making, and innovating, you can make wonders. You can do rapid progress, not only progress in terms of time, but also in terms of quality, in all three directions.
Yeah, I'll give you a different perspective, maybe a more practical one. In our WPP Creative Studio, which is an AI-based studio of tools that we use across the business, we have sort of roughly 3 use case categories. The one is about ideation, the second one about automation, the third one about optimization. And if you kind of measure the amount of inference that's being done across all 3 of those, 2/3 of it is about ideation. So people using AI to come up with better ideas, new ideas, concepts, and to test things against, synthetic focus groups and persona structures and things like that. So, I mean, naturally, in the sort of and they equal a number of tools across all 3 of those categories, but people are gravitating towards ideation. And I think the other thing I would say about brainstorming particularly is that we ran this fantastic workshop in Founders Forum about a month ago, where we divided people into teams to work with AI agents to come up with ideas. And the learning from that experience has really been that working with AI is as much about the user interface and the psychology of the experience, how it makes people feel, as opposed to the underlying AI. And so the way that you design a process to have humans and machines work together, humans work on their own, then have these things tested against virtual agents, then the agents making recommendations and people voting on that. All these kinds of, and I'm not a behavioral scientist, so I'm out of my water here, but all those kind of behavioral, psychological, cues and tricks that we have is as important as the underlying capability. I think one of the key things why ChatGPT blew up is not actually because of the underlying capability. I mean, GPT-2 and 3 were actually completely comparable in terms of capability. It was the UI. It was the blinking cursor, which sort of presupposes this idea that I'm waiting for you to give me something or to ask me something, and then the way that the information came back, not just in chunks of code or in chunks of copy, but in being typed out as if someone is behind the machine, communicating this to you. And these are all UI, sort of sleights of hand. There's nothing technically inherent in why that had to be like that. So I think there's a very interesting thing here about, as we think about brainstorming, ideation, and AI in general, is we have to think about the user experience and how it makes people feel, and what will that do to augment people's creativity and their thinking and make their thought process maybe more overt.
Fascinating. I would like to unpick every single point, but let me just glaze over and move on. I think I heard from you, Rory, the idea of being reminded to do stuff. So I suppose even the most creative people need that reminder to pick up their dry cleaning. So perhaps it will give us more time to be creative. And I heard from you on the end the idea of, an idea of a humanness, and humans want to feel involved in the process. We don't want AI to do stuff for us. We want to feel like they're a co-pilot and that we are creating with them. And on the end, we heard about the sheer rapid amount of ideas they can generate. And that's some words we hear a lot when we talk about AI. Productivity, more. In a world that you could argue needs to slow down. And is the new kind of problem to struggle with which idea to pick? It can generate a million ideas a second, but the true creative challenge is knowing which idea to spend a million seconds on. I was asked recently what the most important skill is in the age of AI, and yes, it's prompt engineering, knowing what you want, being clear about it. But actually, I would argue it's having an opinion, and something we discussed was having taste. And I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Jordan before showed you an example, 4 different options, minute variations created a huge difference. So I would say that in order to get less, you need more first. So you need to be able to explore before you start curating. AI gives you the ability to explore almost without cost in order to have the time and the perspective to curate. We at the advertising industry broadly fall victims of the big idea, an idea like a silver bullet that can do everything and achieve all our objectives in one go. And if you think about it, the reason that this happened was because the scarcity of media environment that we are used to operate requires to distill our thinking into one thing. It was very expensive to air it in TV, so that one thing had to do everything. Right now with AI, we can unshackle ourselves from the tyranny of one idea. The opposite of a good idea may be another good idea. So now we can have many good ideas. We can explore and curate, not necessarily with the need to distill to one single thought or one single chance.
And we can continually refine at speed.
Exactly.
So synthetic research is really, really interesting in that respect, being both fast and you can effectively go back to the same respondents, albeit synthetically, and ask them the, slightly different questions again and again and again, which tends to piss off humans if you do it. So there are extraordinary advantages there, I can see, which are really, really interesting. There is a problem you mentioned, though, which is that nearly all of it derives from words. And one of the things we know in behavioural science...
Sorry, Rory, that's not true.
No. What I'm saying is the models we're frequently using...
No, that's not true. The state-of-the-art models have all become multimodal now. So the models can understand text, video, images, sound as an input. So there are different types of technologies to create content. Those are diffusion models. Yes. But the state-of-the-art large language models are all multimodal. They all can understand multimedia. And not just from a labeling perspective, but from a kind of a semantic understanding perspective. So I can upload a 60-second video to Gemini Ultra and ask it to analyze the emotion of that video and the cultural references, and it will do so very, very successfully.
In which case that changes.
Sorry to be argumentative.
No. I'm out of date, clearly. But I mean, there are problems. What's called the alignment problem, which is, if I'm familiar with this, which is what you direct and optimize something to do can very rapidly become slightly misaligned with what people ultimately want. Now, I'm sure you can build in correctives to this. I mean, I think my concern probably lies down the point I made at the very beginning today, which is great technology arrives as an option and ends up as an obligation, okay? Which is all these things, I've welcomed things in the past. I was, bear in mind, my complete coincidence, my brother's flatmate in Berkeley was the former flatmate of Tim Berners-Lee in CERN. And so I learned about the web very early, I had email very, very early. And every single thing I've welcomed initially, until I suddenly realized that what started as a glorious option actually becomes an imposition. And it's very difficult, I hate to say this, but it's very difficult also. I'm not so much worried about AI developing superpowers. I'm worried about my experience of our client businesses, which is it's very hard to compete with crap and free.
Yeah.
So in areas like customer service, okay, it's unbelievably difficult. You can make the case between really good and expensive versus pretty good and cheap, but competing with crap and free is really, really hard. And, knowing the propensity of, the finance function and the shareholder-driven organization heavily indebted with quarterly targets to view all efficiency as value creation, all cost savings are mistakenly viewed as value creation. Okay, I can see acts of barbarity being enacted on the consumer, not by the people in the room, okay, who are mostly marketers, but by other cost-driven imperatives.
But Rory, I mean, to come back to George's question about creativity and AI, I mean, I want to take a slightly controversial point of view here. I think if I asked everyone in the room to think honestly about how much time in a day do you spend being truly creative? Right? Just contemplate that for a second. How much time, how many minutes a day, how many seconds a day do you spend being truly creative? Or even being truly inquisitional, in the intellectual sense. I mean, like inquiring, about things or really thinking about things. And you'd probably find that, shockingly, for the time that you're awake, maybe 90% of the time, you are either getting around, feeding yourself, talking shit to people, going with the flow, dreaming, or doing manual tasks that are incredibly mind-numbing, finding information, trying to summarize things, following up on emails. I mean, it's... and so, I think, maybe to be controversial as a follow-on to the question is, I think this question about, can machines be creative is a complete misplacement of kind of personal thought. What we should be saying is, how can we make time to be more creative? How can we stimulate ourselves to be more creative and to use our minds properly? And I think this is in the interest of, or in the context of time spent. I think this is the very first thing we should think about is how do we liberate ourselves from the tyranny of mundane tasks, grey work. I think you called it, Georgia, in our pre-call. How do you get rid of grey work so that you can actually make the time for truly intelligent creative work? And then, by all means, figure out how to do that with machines. But, the bar is pretty low.
Mm. And I mean, that's something I wanted to end on, because I know we're running out of time, although I could talk for another 2 hours, is, do you envision this
infinitely more innovative, infinitely more creative, but simply not in the same way that we understand those words right now. Back to the point that Stephan made, is right now we confuse what creativity really means. What is the milliseconds, I would dare to say, in each day that we are truly creative? We believe that many of the tasks that we are doing are creativity. In reality, they are something else. There is filling the dots, checking lists, or making things, which has a creative component, but it's not creativity on itself. So I think if we be able to see the future is definitely going to be different, but it has the potential to exponentially increase humanity. Another phrase that I'm using is, from artificial intelligence, we will see augmented imagination. We will see the ability to do new, better, bigger things.
Mm-hmm. I've got a concern. We're talking about this from a creative perspective, and I'm generally optimistic in that area. In the case of media and the competition for the consumer's attention, if you just imagine just a weird parallel universe where you could create unpaid robot door-to-door salesmen, okay, life would become totally intolerable for ordinary people, okay? Now, if we have different companies competing for attention with more or less limitless potential to generate content and thrust it at them, okay, patently it's not going to work, okay? In other words, I think all media that aren't expensive get killed, email to an extent, okay? The very fact that it doesn't cost you anything actually sort of, it's still very effective, by the way, but it nonetheless destroys it from a consumer's point of view. Ultimately, do we need to reverse the polarity of advertising, where we accept that consumers effectively employ informational agents who go out and seek things, some of which are requested, some of which are surprising but useful, but which are optimized for the individual consumer, not optimized for the brand advertiser? Because with competing advertisers, I can't see anything other than a kind of race to the bottom or a kind of absurdity. I mean, that's my concern, because when you take away cost drives a kind of intelligent targeting. The very fact that it costs an extra £1 to communicate to another person on a direct mail list forces you to think, okay? In this case, effectively, we have to reverse the polarity in some way and give the consumer some control over the messages to which they're exposed, because otherwise the end point is effectively, what you might call hyper-competition. Hyper-competition is the kind of thing, a bit like getting into Harvard, where the price becomes so high that it's no longer worth the prize. You see what I mean? And I can't see us avoiding that unless we actually somehow reverse the direction of travel in some interesting cybernetic way. Does that make sense? I mean, I'd be interested to know, you're the actually great expert here as well. I mean, the question of media targeting and attention does strike me as really important here, because if you can generate messages and transmit them at zero cost.
At the right time, when the person wants it.
Yeah.
I think generative empathy is actually potentially the new big exciting thing. But that's a whole other panel potentially. I think what I would like to leave us with is, perhaps AI is technology for technology's sake. We really are just at the beginning. And I've been in those meetings when we're researching sci-fi films and then seeing how our products can match up to them. And really, we don't know. And I think the most exciting things that we are going to see being created are going to be as a product of human creativity, doing interesting things that we didn't expect. I think if there's one thing to take away, I just hope we don't get held to the biases of the past, particularly things like, for me, female body image. Who decides what intensively beautiful means when you put it into Midjourney? So we've got a real opportunity to change things here. It's really exciting, and I really can't wait to see what happens next. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.